Camp Shanks, New York, May 15, 1943, 0600 hours, and Oberfeldwebel Werner Richter of the Afrika Korps 21st Panzer Division stood in the processing line with 3,000 other German prisoners, watching American guards strip each man of personal belongings while rain poured through gaps in the hastily constructed barracks roof, the water mixing with mud on the floor where they would sleep that night, completely unaware that within weeks he would be transported to Texas where local farmers would invite him to their dinner tables and treat him with a dignity he never expected from his captors. The journey to this moment had begun in the scorching sands of Tunisia, where Rommel's once-invincible Afrika Korps had finally surrendered on May 13, 1943, after running out of fuel, ammunition, and hope, the 275,000 men of Germany's Desert Army laying down their weapons in the largest capitulation of German forces since Stalingrad, knowing they faced an uncertain future as prisoners of the Americans they had fought so fiercely across North Africa. Richter had served with the 21st Panzer Division since the unit arrived in Libya in February 1941, fighting through the seesaw battles of the Desert War, from the lightning advances toward Egypt to the desperate retreats back toward Tunisia, watching as the Afrika Korps gradually lost its superiority in tanks, aircraft, and supplies to the overwhelming industrial might of the American war machine. The surrender itself had come as both a relief and a humiliation. The men of the Afrika Korps who had once driven the British Eighth Army back to the gates of Cairo now standing in long lines waiting to hand over their weapons to American soldiers who seemed impossibly well-fed, well-equipped, and confident in their victory, their Sherman tanks still smoking from the final battles while German Panzer IVs sat abandoned in the desert, empty of fuel and hope. The American soldiers had been surprisingly professional during the surrender, neither gloating nor brutal, simply processing the massive numbers of prisoners with an efficiency that spoke to their overwhelming resources, their medics even treating wounded German soldiers alongside their own, though Richter noticed how the guards kept their weapons ready and their distance measured. The voyage across the Atlantic had been a journey into the unknown, the German prisoners packed into the holds of Liberty ships that had delivered American supplies to North Africa and now returned with human cargo. The men sleeping in hammocks stacked 4 high while wondering if their own U-boats might sink them by mistake, a fear that proved unfounded as the convoy zigzagged across the ocean under heavy escort. During the crossing, Richter had talked with other prisoners about what awaited them in America, some fearing they would be worked to death in labor camps like the Soviets did with German prisoners, others hoping the Americans would honor the Geneva Convention they had signed, though none could have imagined the reality that awaited them in the vast spaces of Texas. The first shock had come when they glimpsed the New York skyline from the ship's deck, the towering buildings untouched by war, the harbor bustling with commerce and military vessels, a stark contrast to the bombed cities of Germany where Allied air raids had reduced entire neighborhoods to rubble, making the prisoners realize just how far from home they were and how completely America remained insulated from the destruction consuming Europe. Camp Shanks had been their introduction to American captivity, a sprawling complex of over 2,000 acres in Orangetown, New York, where the prisoners were processed like military inventory, fingerprinted, photographed, interrogated, and sorted according to their rank, unit, and perceived political reliability. The American intelligence officers particularly interested in identifying committed Nazis who would need to be separated from the general prison population. The camp itself was a shock of contrasts, massive in scale yet hastily constructed, with wooden barracks covered in tar paper that leaked in the rain, inadequate heating for the cold May nights, and a sense of impermanence that suggested the Americans hadn't quite figured out what to do with 425,000 German prisoners who would eventually fill camps across the United States. The guards at Camp Shanks were distant and businesslike, processing the prisoners through medical examinations, delousing stations, and equipment checks with the same efficiency they might have processed their own troops heading overseas, though Richter noticed how they avoided eye contact and kept conversations to a minimum, treating the Germans as problems to be managed rather than men to be understood. The food at Camp Shanks had been adequate but institutional, the same rations American soldiers received according to Geneva Convention requirements, though served with a mechanical indifference that made it clear the prisoners were unwanted guests in a nation mobilized for total war against their homeland. The camp's location near New York City meant constant reminders of American prosperity and power, the prisoners able to see civilian traffic on nearby roads, hear radio broadcasts from the city, and smell food from local restaurants, all while confined behind barbed wire fences and guard towers that made clear their status as enemies in a hostile land. After 2 weeks at Camp Shanks, Richter's group received orders for transfer to permanent camps, the destination kept secret until they boarded trains heading not north to the cold climate many expected, but southwest toward a state most Germans knew only from Karl May's Wild West novels and Hollywood cowboy films, Texas, which would hold more German prisoners than any other state, ultimately housing 78,982 men in camps scattered across its vast territory. The train journey itself was a revelation. The prisoners transported not in cattle cars as they had expected, but in Pullman passenger coaches with comfortable seats and windows through which they could watch the American landscape roll by, farmland and cities untouched by war, factories working at full capacity, and civilians going about their daily lives as if the global conflict was happening on another planet entirely. The guards on the train were more relaxed than those at Camp Shanks, some even sharing cigarettes with prisoners who spoke English, though they kept their weapons close and counted the prisoners at every stop, making clear that while treatment might be civilized, escape would not be tolerated. As the train moved south and west, the landscape began to change, the industrial cities of the Northeast giving way to the farmland of the Midwest, then the vastness of Texas with its endless horizons, scattered ranches, and a sky that seemed impossibly large to men accustomed to the confined spaces of North Africa's coastal strip where the Afrika Korps had fought its desperate battles. The arrival at Camp Hearn, Texas, on June 3, 1943, marked the beginning of an experience that would fundamentally challenge everything Richter and his fellow prisoners had been told about Americans, particularly Texans, whom German propaganda had portrayed as violent cowboys and racial supremacists who would surely mistreat German prisoners with the same brutality Germany was inflicting on Soviet captives. Instead, the prisoners found themselves in a camp that, while still surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, offered amenities that seemed impossible for a prison camp: hot showers, recreational facilities, a camp theater where prisoners could stage their own productions, and most surprisingly, regular interaction with local civilians who needed their labor to replace the American men gone to war. Camp Hearn sprawled across 680 acres of Texas prairie, divided into 3 compounds that could hold 4,800 prisoners total, with wooden barracks that, unlike Camp Shanks, were well-constructed and weatherproofed against the Texas heat, each building housing 50 men in relative comfort with individual bunks, footlockers for personal belongings, and windows that could be opened to catch the evening breeze. The camp commandant, Colonel Clyde S. Inman, set a tone from the beginning that surprised the German prisoners, treating them not as defeated enemies to be punished but as soldiers who had fought honorably and deserved respect under the rules of war, even addressing the German officers by their ranks and allowing them to maintain military discipline within their own units. The first indication that Texas would be different came during the orientation briefing, when Colonel Inman explained through interpreters that prisoners who volunteered for work details would earn 80 cents per day in canteen coupons, could purchase personal items and food at the camp store, and would be transported to local farms and businesses where they would work alongside civilian employees, all in accordance with Geneva Convention provisions that the Germans had assumed would be ignored. The German officers, including Richter as a senior non-commissioned officer, were not required to work but could volunteer if they wished, a distinction that maintained military hierarchy and dignity in a way the processing at Camp Shanks had deliberately stripped away, treating all prisoners as identical units to be managed rather than soldiers with ranks and responsibilities. The real transformation in the prisoners' experience came when the first work details departed for local farms. The men loaded onto trucks with minimal guard supervision, driven through the gates that had seemed so permanent, and delivered to Texas farmers who desperately needed help with their cotton, corn, and grain harvests. Hans Mueller, a private from Richter's unit, returned from his first day working on the farm of Jim Patterson near Hearn with a story that spread through the camp like wildfire, describing how the Texas farmer had invited him to eat lunch at the family table, served him the same food the family ate, and talked to him through his teenage daughter who spoke some German, asking about his family and life before the war rather than treating him as a faceless enemy. This pattern repeated across the work details, Texas farmers who initially viewed the German prisoners with suspicion quickly recognizing them as young men not unlike their own sons fighting overseas, skilled workers who took pride in their labor, and human beings caught up in a war that had swept up millions on both sides. The farmers of Robertson County, where Camp Hearn was located, had initially protested the camp's construction, fearing escaped prisoners and Nazi infiltration, but within weeks of the first work details, they were petitioning the camp commander for more prisoners to help with their harvests, some even learning basic German phrases to better communicate with their temporary workers. The contrast with the prisoners' brief experience in New York could not have been more stark, where civilians had stared at them with undisguised hatred as they marched from trains to Camp Shanks, some throwing stones or shouting curses at the men they blamed for American deaths in North Africa and Europe. In Texas, civilians gradually began waving at the prison trucks passing on rural roads, children gathering at fence lines to watch the Germans work in the fields, and farmers' wives sending extra food for the work details, knowing the prisoners appreciated home-cooked meals after months of military rations. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann, captured with the 15th Panzer Division, wrote in his secret diary about working on the ranch of Walter Schulz, a Texas German whose grandparents had emigrated from Westphalia in the 1850s, and who spoke to the prisoners in accented but understandable German, sharing stories of how his family had maintained their German traditions while becoming thoroughly Texan. Schulz's ranch near Brenham employed 12 German prisoners during the 1943 harvest season, housing them in a converted barn during the work week, allowing them to swim in the stock pond after work, and joining them in the evenings for card games and conversation that reminded the prisoners of village life in Germany before the war had changed everything. The presence of German Texan communities throughout the state created unexpected connections between prisoners and locals, particularly in the Texas Hill Country where towns like Fredericksburg, New Braunfels, and Comfort had been founded by German immigrants in the 1840s and still maintained German customs, architecture, and even language more than a century later. When prisoners from Camp Brady were assigned to work in Fredericksburg, they found themselves in a town where German was spoken on the streets, German-style beer gardens operated openly, and the local Lutheran church held services in German, creating a surreal experience of finding a piece of Germany in the heart of Texas. The cultural shock worked both ways, as Texas farmers discovered that their German prisoners included not just simple soldiers but engineers, teachers, musicians, and craftsmen whose skills could be valuable beyond simple farm labor, leading to arrangements where prisoners repaired machinery, built barns, taught local children mathematics, and even helped design irrigation systems. Otto Kleist, a civil engineer captured with the Afrika Korps, spent 6 months working with Robertson County officials to improve local roads and bridges, his expertise so valued that the county commissioners petitioned unsuccessfully to keep him in Texas after the war ended, offering to sponsor his immigration if regulations permitted. The camp newspaper at Herne, written and printed by the prisoners themselves, reflected this evolving relationship with their captors, early issues filled with defiant Nazi propaganda gradually giving way to practical information about camp life, English lessons, and even appreciative articles about Texas culture and history. The transformation was not universal or immediate, as committed Nazis within the camps maintained pressure on their fellow prisoners to resist American influence, organizing secret courts to punish those they considered traitors, and maintaining communication networks that connected Nazi loyalists across the POW camp system. This internal conflict came to a violent head at Camp Herne on December 17, 1943, when Hugo Kraus, a German-American who had returned to Germany before the war and been drafted into the Afrika Korps, was beaten to death by fellow prisoners for his cooperation with American authorities and criticism of the Nazi regime. The murder shocked both prisoners and Americans, leading to investigations, transfers of suspected Nazi agitators to special camps, and increased efforts to separate committed Nazis from the general prison population, though the violence also demonstrated that not all Germans embraced the humane treatment they received in Texas. Despite such incidents, the overall experience of German prisoners in Texas camps continued to contrast dramatically with their initial processing through Camp Shanks and other northern facilities, where bureaucratic efficiency and emotional distance characterized prisoner treatment. In Texas, the combination of agricultural necessity, cultural connections through German Texan communities, and what many prisoners described as a fundamentally different American attitude created relationships that transcended the prisoner-captor dynamic, though always within the constraints of wartime captivity. Gefreiter Friedrich Hoffmann, writing to his family through Red Cross channels, described his 18 months at Camp Mahia, where he worked on local farms, learned English from a retired schoolteacher who volunteered at the camp, and played soccer on Sundays with guards and prisoners together, an experience so different from what he had expected that he struggled to convey it to family members living under Allied bombing in Germany. His letters, censored but generally delivered, spoke of Texas farmers who shared their lunch, guards who refereed soccer matches fairly, and a camp commander who allowed prisoners to build an elaborate fountain in the compound, complete with decorative stonework that reminded them of village squares in Germany. The economic relationship between prisoners and local communities deepened as the war continued, Texas farmers paying the government $150 per day for prisoner labor, with 80 cents going to the prisoners in canteen coupons and the remainder helping offset the costs of the POW program, a system that made economic sense while maintaining Geneva Convention requirements for prisoner compensation. By 1944, German prisoners in Texas were harvesting cotton on thousands of farms, picking fruit in the Rio Grande Valley, cutting timber in East Texas, and even working in non-agricultural settings like the Denison Dam project, where their engineering expertise proved valuable in the massive construction effort. This economic integration reached levels that would have seemed impossible at Camp Shanks, where prisoners were kept isolated from civilian society and productive labor was secondary to security concerns. In Texas, entire communities became dependent on prisoner labor, the town of Navasota housing prisoners in circus tents during harvest season when the branch camp's capacity was exceeded, local residents bringing coffee and pastries to the workers despite official regulations discouraging fraternization, creating bonds that military authorities struggled to control. The transformation in prisoner attitudes was documented by American intelligence officers who conducted regular interviews and monitored mail, noting that references to Nazi ideology decreased markedly among prisoners in Texas camps, replaced by discussions of American democracy, individual freedom, and particularly the treatment they received from ordinary Texans who saw them as men rather than enemies. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Davison, chief of the Special Projects Division responsible for prisoner re-education, reported that Texas camps showed the highest rates of voluntary participation in democracy classes, English instruction, and American history courses, though he acknowledged that humane treatment by civilians contributed more to changing attitudes than formal education programs. Not all German prisoners experienced this transformation equally, officers generally maintaining stronger ideological commitment than enlisted men, younger soldiers who had grown up entirely under Nazi rule showing more resistance to American influence than older men who remembered pre-Nazi Germany, and members of elite units like the Waffen-SS, though few were captured in North Africa, displaying fanatical loyalty that no amount of kind treatment could shake. The American authorities responded by establishing special camps for incorrigible Nazis, including Camp Alva in Oklahoma, where prisoners who threatened or attacked fellow Germans for cooperating with Americans were isolated from the general population. Though even there, guards reported that Texas-style treatment gradually softened some of the most committed ideologues. The contrast between regions became a topic of discussion among the prisoners themselves, letters and illegal communications between camps sharing information about conditions, work opportunities, and civilian attitudes, with camps in Texas, Arizona, and other southwestern states consistently rated as preferable to facilities in the Northeast and Upper Midwest. Oberfeldwebel Wilhelm Schnell, transferred from Camp Shanks to Camp Bowie near Brownwood, Texas, wrote that the difference was like moving from a gray industrial prison to an open-air work camp where dignity and humanity still existed, though both were technically POW facilities operating under the same regulations. The role of German Texan communities in shaping prisoner experiences cannot be overstated. These established Americans of German descent serving as bridges between two cultures at war, translating not just language but customs and expectations that helped both prisoners and guards navigate the complex dynamics of wartime captivity. In towns like Seguin, where German prisoners worked alongside German-American farmers whose families had left the same regions of Germany decades earlier, the war sometimes seemed like a distant abstraction, the shared language and culture creating connections that transcended national boundaries and current conflicts. Some of the most profound transformations occurred through religious connections, Lutheran and Catholic chaplains from German Texan congregations conducting services in the camps, providing German-language Bibles and religious materials, and creating spaces where prisoners could maintain their spiritual lives despite physical captivity. Father Alois Beck, a German-American priest from San Antonio, conducted weekly masses at Camp Fort Sam Houston, reporting that attendance grew steadily as prisoners found in religious practice a reminder of home and humanity that military captivity could not provide, the shared faith creating bonds that political ideology could not break. The Christmas of 1943 marked a turning point for many prisoners, as Texas communities organized celebrations that included the camps, local churches donating Christmas trees, families sending homemade cookies and cakes, and some camps allowing prisoners to visit nearby churches for Christmas services under guard. At Camp Brady, the prisoners constructed an elaborate nativity scene that drew visitors from across McCulloch County. the artistic skill of the German craftsmen creating a display that became an annual tradition, with local residents contributing materials and decorations that transformed the prison compound into something resembling a German Christmas market. Hauptmann Ernst Müller, a company commander in the 21st Panzer Division, initially forbade his men from participating in American organized activities, maintaining strict military discipline and Nazi ideology within his barracks, but gradually found his authority undermined by the daily reality of humane treatment. His own transformation came through an unlikely source, the camp library at Herne, where he discovered German-language editions of American literature and history that challenged the propaganda he had absorbed during 12 years of Nazi rule, particularly the works of German-American authors who had fled Nazi persecution and found freedom in America. The labor program expanded dramatically in 1944 as American forces pressed into Europe and the Pacific, creating even greater manpower shortages on the home front, with German prisoners becoming essential to agricultural production across Texas. By the summer of 1944, prisoners from Texas camps were working on over 1,000 farms and ranches, picking cotton in the Brazos Valley, harvesting vegetables in the Winter Garden region, cutting sugarcane near the Gulf Coast, and maintaining the food production that fed both American forces overseas and civilians at home. This economic integration created situations that would have seemed impossible when the Afrika Korps surrendered in Tunisia, German prisoners operating American farm machinery, teaching Texas farm boys German while learning English and American slang in return, and developing expertise in American agricultural methods that some would later apply when rebuilding Germany's devastated farmland. Unteroffizier Hans Weber, a tank mechanic with the 15th Panzer Division, became so skilled at repairing cotton gins and tractors that several Texas farmers offered to sponsor his return to America after the war, though immigration law prevented former enemy soldiers from returning for many years. The relationships formed during these work assignments often transcended the war itself, farmers and prisoners maintaining correspondence for decades after repatriation. Some Germans returning as tourists to visit the families that had treated them with kindness during their captivity, and children who had known the prisoners as workers on their family farms traveling to Germany to meet them in their homeland. The Braun family of Gonzales County corresponded with their prisoners for 40 years, visiting 3 of them in Germany in 1975, where they were received as honored guests by men who credited Texas kindness with maintaining their faith in humanity during the darkest period of their lives. Security at Texas camps reflected the evolved relationship between prisoners and captors. Escape attempts rare not because security was particularly tight, but because prisoners recognized they were better off in the camps than trying to survive as fugitives in the vast Texas landscape where their accents and appearance would immediately mark them as foreign. When escapes did occur, they were often more about young men seeking adventure or female companionship than serious attempts to return to Germany, most escapees surrendering within days, hungry and sunburned, sometimes at the very farms where they had worked, knowing the farmers would return them safely to camp rather than harm them. Gefreiter Johann Schmidt's escape from Camp Herne in August 1944 illustrated this dynamic, the 22-year-old slipping away from a work detail to visit a young woman he had met while working on her father's farm, spending 3 days hidden in their barn before the girl's father discovered him and drove him back to camp. The farmer refused to press charges, telling camp authorities that Schmidt had worked hard on his farm and made a young man's mistake. The incident handled more like a teenager breaking curfew than an enemy soldier attempting escape, though Schmidt still received 30 days in the camp stockade as military discipline required. The D-Day invasion of June 6, 1944, created complex emotions within the camps, prisoners torn between patriotic hope that Germany might still repel the invasion and growing recognition that the war was lost, their American captors suddenly less tolerant of Nazi symbols and rhetoric as casualty lists from Normandy reached Texas communities. Some prisoners celebrated the initial German resistance, singing patriotic songs and displaying homemade Nazi flags, while others quietly recognized that Allied victory meant the end of the Nazi regime that had led them into catastrophe, these divisions creating tensions that camp authorities struggled to manage. The revelation of concentration camps as Allied forces advanced into Germany profoundly affected the prison camps, American authorities organizing mandatory viewings of liberation footage that many prisoners initially dismissed as propaganda but gradually recognized as truth, shattering the worldview that had sustained them through years of war. Oberleutnant Paul Richter, Werner's younger brother captured with the Hermann Göring Division in Italy and later transferred to Texas, wrote about watching films from Bergen-Belsen and Dachau at Camp Wolters, describing how decorated Afrika Korps veterans wept openly as they realized what their nation had done while they fought in distant deserts. These revelations accelerated the transformation already underway in many prisoners' thinking, the humane treatment they had received in Texas contrasting even more starkly with the systematic cruelty their own government had perpetrated, leading to profound psychological crises as men tried to reconcile their patriotic service with their nation's crimes. The American re-education program, which had achieved limited success through formal classes and propaganda, suddenly found receptive audiences as prisoners sought to understand how their cultured nation had descended into barbarism while their captors, whom they had been taught to despise as uncultured cowboys, had treated them with dignity and respect. As Germany's surrender became imminent in early 1945, the atmosphere in Texas camps shifted from the routine of agricultural work and prison life to uncertainty about the future, prisoners wondering whether they would be quickly repatriated or held for years as forced laborers to rebuild Europe. The answer came slowly and unevenly. Some prisoners with needed skills kept in the United States until 1946, others transferred to Britain and France where they faced harsher treatment and longer captivity, the Texas experience becoming a golden memory that many would idealize for the rest of their lives. The final months in Texas camps saw remarkable scenes as communities that had initially feared the prisoners now protested their departure. Farmers petitioning authorities to keep their workers, families organizing farewell dinners for prisoners who had become familiar figures in their fields and towns. At Camp Swift near Bastrop, the city council passed a resolution thanking the German prisoners for their contribution to the local economy, while individual families brought gifts and addresses, encouraging the prisoners to write and promising to help if immigration ever became possible. Feldwebel Werner Richter's last month at Camp Hearn exemplified these transformed relationships. Local farmers organizing a baseball game between prisoners and civilians, the Germans losing badly but enjoying American beer and barbecue afterward, the barbed wire fences seeming almost irrelevant as captors and captives shared stories and addresses. Mrs. Patricia Anderson, whose husband was fighting in Europe, gave Richter a Bible inscribed with the message, "May you find your way home safely and remember that not all Americans are your enemies." A sentiment that would have seemed treasonous in 1943 but reflected the human connections formed through 2 years of daily interaction. The contrast with their arrival at Camp Shanks could not have been more complete, the hostile processing center in New York now seeming like something from another lifetime as Texas families gathered at train stations to wave goodbye to departing prisoners. Some prisoners wept openly as they boarded trains for the journey to embarkation ports, not from joy at going home but from sadness at leaving a place where they had rediscovered their humanity after the dehumanizing experience of war, mechanized slaughter in North Africa, and initial treatment as dangerous enemies in New York. The journey back through Camp Shanks in early 1946 provided a final stark reminder of regional differences in American attitudes toward German prisoners, the New York facility still cold and efficient, processing repatriating prisoners with the same mechanical indifference it had shown during their arrival 3 years earlier. Guards who had never worked in southern camps expressed surprise at prisoners who spoke fluent English, talked fondly of American families, and seemed reluctant to leave, unable to understand how enemies had become something approaching friends in the vast spaces of Texas where pragmatism and humanity had overcome wartime hatred. Statistical analysis of prisoner communications and post-war immigration records revealed the profound impact of regional treatment differences. Prisoners from Texas camps showing the highest rates of positive correspondence about their captivity, the greatest interest in returning to America, and the strongest adoption of democratic values in post-war surveys. Of the approximately 5,000 German POWs who eventually immigrated to the United States in the 1950s when laws changed, nearly 40% had been held in Texas camps, many settling in the same communities where they had been prisoners, resuming friendships that had begun across barbed wire fences. Hans Mueller, the private who had eaten at Jim Patterson's table on his first work assignment, returned to Texas in 1952, married Patterson's daughter Margaret, whom he had corresponded with for 6 years, and took over the family farm when Jim retired, becoming a respected member of the community that had once held him prisoner. His story was exceptional but not unique, dozens of former prisoners finding ways to return to Texas, drawn by memories of humanity during inhumanity, dignity during captivity, and recognition that Texans had seen them as men when their own ideology had reduced them to cogs in a war machine. The legacy of German prisoners in Texas extended beyond individual relationships to influence the state's agricultural development, construction techniques, and cultural landscape, the camps themselves mostly disappearing but the connections they created enduring through generations. Children who had watched German prisoners work their family farms grew up with a nuanced understanding of war and enemies, Recognizing that circumstances rather than inherent evil had placed these men on opposite sides of a global conflict, lessons they would carry into America's subsequent wars and international engagements. Academic studies of the POW experience in America consistently highlighted the Texas anomaly, where practical needs, cultural connections, and regional attitudes combined to create an environment that challenged both American and German preconceptions about enemies and war. Sociologist Dr. Margaret Thompson's 1962 study noted that German POWs in Texas camps showed significantly lower rates of post-traumatic stress, higher rates of successful reintegration into civilian life, and more positive attitudes toward their former enemies than prisoners held in other regions, particularly those processed through northeastern facilities like Camp Shanks. The phrase that echoed through prisoner accounts, repeated in letters, memoirs, and interviews decades after the war, was remarkably consistent. "The Texans treated us like men." This simple statement carried profound meaning for soldiers who had been dehumanized by their own ideology, mechanized warfare, defeat, and initial captivity, finding in the unlikely setting of Texas prison camps a restoration of dignity that would shape their remaining lives. Oberfeldwebel Wilhelm Schnell, writing his memoirs in 1975, reflected that his 2 years in Texas had taught him more about democracy and human dignity than 12 years of Nazi education had taught him about racial superiority and national destiny, the daily experience of respectful treatment more powerful than any propaganda or re-education program. He particularly remembered a moment when his guard, Sergeant James Williams from Houston, had shared his lunch and talked about his own fears for his brother fighting in Italy, two enemies recognizing their common humanity over sandwiches and warm Dr. Pepper in a cotton field near Navasota. The transformation of Camp Hearn into a museum and memorial in the 21st century brought aging German veterans back to Texas, men in their 80s and 90s returning to the place where they had spent their youth as prisoners, often accompanied by children and grandchildren curious about this chapter of family history. These visits invariably included reunions with Texas families who had employed them, emotional gatherings where former enemies embraced as old friends, sharing photographs of grandchildren and memories of a time when war had paradoxically brought them together rather than keeping them apart. Helmut Fischer, who had served as a radio operator with the 21st Panzer Division, returned to Camp Hearn in 2001 at age 79, standing in the reconstructed barracks where he had spent 2 years of his youth, telling his grandson about the Texas farmers who had treated him with kindness when he expected hatred. He particularly remembered Bill Crawford, a farmer near Calvert who had lost a son in Sicily but still shared his lunch with German prisoners, telling them that hate wouldn't bring his boy back but kindness might prevent future wars, a philosophy that had influenced Fischer's entire post-war life as a teacher and peace activist in Germany. The economic impact of German prisoner labor in Texas was quantified in various studies, showing that POWs had harvested over 100 million pounds of cotton, maintained thousands of miles of roads, and contributed an estimated $70 million to the state's wartime economy, figures that only partially captured their true contribution. Beyond raw numbers, the prisoners had helped maintain agricultural production when labor shortages might have crippled the food supply, their skilled work on infrastructure projects advancing some regions by years, and their cultural contributions enriching communities that might otherwise have remained isolated from European influences. Cultural exchanges that began in the camps continued long after repatriation, Texas churches maintaining partnerships with German congregations, schools establishing exchange programs, and businesses developing trade relationships that originated in connections made between prisoners and local businessmen. The city of Brenham became sister cities with Neidenstein, Germany, after discovering that several former POWs from Camp Brenham had come from that town, the relationship fostering cultural and economic exchanges that continued into the 21st century, testament to bonds formed during wartime captivity. The influence extended to popular culture and collective memory, Texas communities that had hosted camps maintaining museums, historical markers, and annual commemorations that presented a nuanced view of the enemy as human beings caught in historical circumstances rather than inhuman monsters. The Aliceville Museum in Alabama, established by a Texas historian who had studied camps in both states, explicitly contrasted the Texas experience with harsher treatment elsewhere, using oral histories and artifacts to demonstrate how regional culture and individual choices had shaped vastly different prisoner experiences within the same national system. Comparative analysis of German POW memoirs revealed consistent patterns in how prisoners described their American captivity, with Camp Shanks and similar northeastern facilities characterized as efficient but cold, Midwestern camps as adequate but impersonal, and Texas camps as surprisingly humane and personally transformative. The distinction was not simply about material conditions, which were generally similar across the camp system, but about human interaction, dignity, and the recognition of common humanity that Texas communities had extended to their unwilling guests. Dr. Ernst Hoffmann, a historian at the University of Munich who had been a young soldier in the Afrika Korps and prisoner at Camp Mehea, spent decades researching and writing about the POW experience, concluding that Texas had provided an inadvertent model for post-war reconciliation. His work emphasized how practical cooperation, economic interdependence, and personal relationships had overcome ideological divisions and wartime hatred more effectively than formal re-education programs or political pressure, lessons applicable to other post-conflict situations where former enemies must learn to coexist. The story of Hugo Kraus, murdered at Camp Hearn for cooperating with Americans, became a cautionary tale about the persistence of extremist ideology even in benign environments. His death commemorated alongside the positive memories of prisoner-civilian cooperation. His sacrifice reminded historians that not all Germans had embraced the humanity offered in Texas, some clinging to Nazi ideology despite overwhelming evidence of its moral bankruptcy. Their resistance ultimately futile but temporarily dangerous to fellow prisoners who chose different paths. Religious organizations played a crucial but often overlooked role in shaping the Texas POW experience, Lutheran and Catholic churches in particular providing spiritual support that transcended national boundaries and political ideologies. Pastor Friedrich Neuhaus, captured with the Afrika Korps and assigned to Camp Brady, conducted services for fellow prisoners while developing relationships with local Lutheran pastors who provided German language materials and eventually sponsored his return to America as a missionary to German immigrant communities. The role of women in the Texas POW experience challenged both German and American gender expectations, farmers' wives and daughters often serving as interpreters and intermediaries between prisoners and their employers, creating complex dynamics that military authorities struggled to manage. Some relationships evolved into romances that survived years of separation and legal obstacles, though most remained within bounds of propriety, while demonstrating that human connection could transcend the artificial barriers of war and imprisonment. Margaret Schmidt, daughter of a Texas German farmer near Fredericksburg, taught English to prisoners from Camp Brady who worked on her father's ranch, later marrying former Unteroffizier Karl Brenner when he returned to Texas in 1951 after working 6 years to earn passage back to America. Their story, while romantic, also illustrated the practical challenges faced by former enemies trying to build lives together, including discrimination from some Americans who couldn't forget the war and suspicion from Germans who saw Karl's emigration as betrayal, though the couple ultimately found acceptance in the German Texan community that had bridged both worlds. The medical care provided to German prisoners in Texas camps exceeded Geneva Convention requirements and often surpassed what American civilians could access. Camp hospitals staffed by American doctors and German medical personnel treating everything from work injuries to chronic conditions with a professionalism that surprised prisoners accustomed to being treated as expendable by their own military. Dr. Wilhelm Becker, a surgeon captured in Tunisia, worked at the Camp Hearn Hospital for 2 years, later writing that he had learned more about medical ethics from American colleagues who treated enemies and allies equally than from his entire German medical education that had been corrupted by Nazi racial theories. Educational opportunities in Texas camps ranged from basic literacy classes to university-level courses, some prisoners earning credits that German universities later recognized, though the most profound education came through daily interaction with American democracy in practice. The camp newspapers, edited by prisoners but subject to American censorship, evolved from propaganda organs to genuine forums for discussion about politics, culture, and the future of Germany, their pages revealing the gradual transformation of Nazi soldiers into men who could envision a democratic future for their defeated nation. The Special Projects Division's formal re-education program, designed to democratize German prisoners through classes and carefully selected materials, achieved mixed results across the camp system but found unusual success in Texas where practical experience reinforced theoretical lessons. Prisoners who had dismissed American democracy as weak and chaotic while fighting in North Africa gradually recognized its strengths through observing Texas communities governing themselves, resolving disputes through law rather than force, and including diverse voices in decision-making processes that would have been unthinkable in Nazi Germany. Athletic competitions between camps and with local teams provided another avenue for humanizing interaction, soccer matches drawing crowds of Texas civilians who cheered good plays regardless of which team made them. The sports field becoming neutral ground where nationality mattered less than skill and sportsmanship. The championship match between Camp Hearn and Camp Mohea in October 1944 drew over 3,000 spectators, including the mayors of both towns, the governors of both camps, and hundreds of civilians who paid admission fees that went to the International Red Cross, the event resembling a county fair more than a gathering at a prison camp. Music transcended language barriers more effectively than any other cultural medium, camp orchestras and choirs performing for mixed audiences of prisoners, guards, and civilians, their repertoires ranging from German folk songs to American jazz, creating shared emotional experiences that political speeches could never achieve. The Camp Wolters Orchestra, directed by a former Berlin Philharmonic violinist, gave monthly concerts that drew audiences from across North Texas. Their performance of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony on Christmas Eve 1944 moving both German prisoners and American guards to tears as they recognized their common humanity in the music's universal message of brotherhood. The agricultural techniques German prisoners learned in Texas proved valuable during post-war Reconstruction, several former POWs becoming agricultural advisors in the American occupation zone, applying irrigation methods and crop rotation practices they had learned on Texas farms to restore German agriculture devastated by war. Fritz Weber, who had worked on cotton farms near Corpus Christi, introduced mechanical cotton picking to experimental farms in Bavaria, adapting Texas techniques to German conditions and helping modernize agricultural practices that had remained unchanged for generations. The psychological impact of the Texas experience on German prisoners extended far beyond their captivity, influencing their roles in rebuilding democratic Germany and shaping their children's attitudes toward America and democracy. Post-war surveys of former POWs consistently showed that those held in Texas camps were more likely to support Democratic parties, maintain positive views of America, and encourage international cooperation than prisoners held in other regions, their experiences serving as personal counter-narratives to both Nazi propaganda and emerging Cold War tensions. As the Cold War developed and Germany divided, former Texas POWs in both East and West Germany maintained their American connections despite political pressure, their letters to Texas friends providing insights into life behind the Iron Curtain and helping maintain human connections across ideological divides. Hans Richter, Werner's cousin who ended up in East Germany, risked imprisonment by corresponding with the Patterson family in Texas for 30 years. His letters smuggled through church networks revealing how memories of Texas humanity sustained hope during decades of communist oppression. The generational impact became evident as children and grandchildren of former POWs developed special connections to Texas, many choosing to study at Texas universities, work for Texas companies, or vacation in the state their fathers and grandfathers had described in stories that seemed almost mythical. The University of Texas at Austin reported that between 1960 and 2000, over 200 German students had enrolled specifically because their relatives had been POWs in Texas, these educational exchanges strengthening cultural and economic ties that originated in wartime captivity. Economic historians calculated that the relationships formed between German POWs and Texas businesses during the war contributed to over $500 million in trade between Texas and Germany by 1980, former prisoners serving as informal ambassadors who understood both cultures and could facilitate business relationships. Klaus Mueller, imprisoned at Camp Swift, became a senior executive at Siemens and helped establish the company's major facility in Austin, explicitly citing his positive wartime experiences in Texas as influencing the location decision that brought thousands of jobs to the region. The transformation of former enemies into friends and business partners challenged traditional narratives about war and peace, suggesting that human decency and practical cooperation could overcome even the most intense conflicts if individuals chose to see enemies as fellow human beings rather than abstractions. The Texas POW experience became a case study in conflict resolution programs at military academies and peace studies departments. Its lessons about the power of dignity and respect in transforming adversarial relationships applicable to contemporary conflicts where former enemies must learn to coexist. Environmental historians noted that German POWs had contributed to significant conservation projects in Texas, their work on soil conservation, reforestation, and water management reflecting European practices that American farmers later adopted, the prisoners' labor creating lasting improvements to the landscape they had temporarily inhabited. The terraced fields near Camp Brady, engineered by German prisoners to prevent erosion, remained productive into the 21st century, physical reminders of the constructive legacy that emerged from wartime captivity. The preservation of camp artifacts and structures became important to both Texas communities and German veterans organizations. Collaborative efforts to maintain historical sites demonstrating how former enemies had become partners in preserving their shared history. The restoration of Camp Hearn's fountains, built by prisoners and decorated with intricate stonework depicting German and Texan motifs, involved former POWs, their families, local historians, and community volunteers working together to preserve physical reminders of a unique chapter in both German and Texas history. Literary works by former POWs about their Texas experiences contributed to both German and American literature. Their memoirs, novels, and poetry exploring themes of captivity, humanity, and redemption that resonated with readers who had never experienced war or imprisonment. Werner Richter's grandson, Thomas, became a successful novelist whose works exploring German-American identity drew heavily on his grandfather's stories about finding humanity in a Texas prison camp, the third generation carrying forward lessons learned behind barbed wire into contemporary discussions about immigration, identity, and belonging. The story reached its most poignant conclusion in the 21st century as the last surviving POWs made final pilgrimages to Texas, elderly men returning to places where they had spent their youth, often finding that their captivity had been the defining experience of their lives. Wolfgang Bauer, age 93, visited Camp Fannin near Tyler in 2018, the last known Afrika Korps veteran to return to Texas, spending hours talking with local historians about comrades long dead and Texas families who had shown kindness to young enemies far from home. His visit covered by German and American media as the end of an era. His final words to the assembled crowd at the camp memorial captured the essence of what thousands of German prisoners had experienced in Texas. We came as enemies, prisoners of war from a defeated army, expecting hatred and revenge. Instead, we found humanity. The Texans saw us not as Nazis or enemies, but as young men caught in a terrible war. They shared their food, their stories, and their dignity with us. They treated us like men when our own ideology had taught us to be machines. This is why so many of us tried to return, why we told our children and grandchildren about Texas, why we never forgot. In our darkest hour, Texas showed us light. The memorial at Camp Hearn now includes a plaque donated by German veterans organizations with a simple inscription in English and German. Here, enemies became friends through dignity and respect. May their example guide future generations. The plaque stands near the restored fountains where German prisoners once gathered in the evenings, sharing letters from home and dreams of peace, discovering in the unlikely setting of a Texas prison camp that humanity could survive even the most dehumanizing of wars. The academic consensus that emerged from decades of research confirmed what the prisoners themselves had always known, that regional culture, individual choices, and practical necessity had combined in Texas to create an environment where the Geneva Convention's minimum standards had been exceeded not through policy but through human decency. The contrast with facilities like Camp Shanks demonstrated that even within a single nation's prison system, the treatment of enemies could vary dramatically based on local attitudes, economic needs, and cultural connections that transcended wartime hostility.